It started as a simple getaway, a break from the city, from deadlines, from the constant hum of modern life. I had always been drawn to solitude, and when I found the listing for a remote cabin deep in the woods, it felt like exactly what I needed. The description was vague, but that only added to the allure. A quiet retreat where time slows down. Perfect. The drive out was longer than I expected. My GPS lost signal halfway through, leaving me to rely on an old crumpled map I had printed as a backup. The deeper I went into the forest, the more the road seemed to dissolve into nature, branches scraping against my car like skeletal fingers. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, casting long golden shadows through the trees. The cabin stood alone in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the breeze. It was old but well kept, with dark wooden walls and a slanted roof covered in moss. Something about it felt still, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was different here, thick, almost heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of insects, just silence. Grabbing my bag, I walked up to the door and tested the handle. It turned easily, and the door creaked open with a sigh, revealing the dim interior. Dust floated in the light from the setting sun. A fireplace sat cold against the far wall, with a few logs stacked neatly beside it. There was a single armchair, a small wooden table, and a bed pushed against the back corner. Simple, almost too simple. As I stepped inside, something odd happened. I felt a shift, like the air thickened for just a second before settling again. A brief moment of disorientation, like stepping off an escalator that wasn't moving. I shook it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. There was an old clock on the mantel, its brass frame tarnished with age. The hands read 6:12. I glanced at my watch. 6:12, weirdly precise but not impossible. I set my bag down and walked to the single window facing the woods. The trees stood motionless, their branches frozen in place. No wind, no movement, just an eerie painted stillness. For the first time, a strange thought crept into my mind. Had the sun moved at all since I arrived? I shook off the unsettling thought and turned away from the window. It had been a long drive, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. I busied myself unpacking, placing my flashlight, notebook, and a couple of books on the small wooden table. The air inside the cabin was thick, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. A hint of metal, maybe. After setting up, I decided to check the time again. My watch still read not 6:12. That didn't make sense. I tapped the glass, held it to my ear. It was ticking. I glanced at the clock on the mantel. 6:12. My phone? 6:12. A chill ran down my spine. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe all three just happened to be stuck. Or maybe I had lost track of time while settling in. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I stepped outside, letting the cool evening air wash over me. The sun still hung low, exactly where it had been when I arrived. The sky remained frozen in shades of gold and orange, as if time had simply stopped. I took a deep breath and walked toward the tree line. The dirt beneath my boots was dry, undisturbed. The deeper I went, the more the silence pressed in around me. No birds, no wind, no crunch of leaves beneath my feet. It was like stepping into a photograph. Everything perfectly still, perfectly preserved. Then, just as I turned to head back, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My own footprints, leading Spatgescher back to the cabin. I hadn't turned around yet. I had only walked forward, and yet somehow my own trail was there, imprinted in the dirt, as if I had already returned. A cold panic settled in my chest. I took a slow, deliberate step to test the ground. Another footprint appeared, but not in front of me, behind me. As if I had already taken that step a moment before. I actually did. Heart pounding, I forced myself to move. I wasn't going to stand here and try to rationalize something that clearly wasn't rational. As soon as I stepped back inside the cabin, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My breath was uneven, my hands trembling. I grabbed my phone again. Still a SATS. 612. I opened the camera, intending to take a video, to have some kind of proof that I wasn't imagining things. But the second I hit record, the screen froze. Not an error message, not a crash. Just a frozen frame of me staring back at myself. I lowered the phone slowly, a deep unease settling over me. Then, from behind me, a soft tap, tap, a tap echoed through the cabin. I wasn't alone. The sound sent a jolt through my entire body. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, deliberate rhythm, like fingertips against wood. It was coming from behind me, somewhere near the fireplace. I turned, my pulse hammering in my ears. The cabin was dim, the last light of the frozen sun barely seeping through the window. My eyes darted to the clock. Still 6:12. The air was thick, charged with something unseen, something watching. I took a hesitant step forward, scanning the room. The sound had stopped. Silence wrapped around me again, heavy and suffocating. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the crawling sensation at the back of my neck. It felt like the air itself was pressing down on me, thick and unmoving, as if I had stepped into a place where the normal rules of existence no longer applied. And then, the tapping started again. This time, it came from the window. A slow scraping drag against the glass. My breath hitched. My legs felt locked in place, frozen like everything else around me. But I forced myself to look. There was nothing there. Just the reflection of the room, dark and distorted in the old glass. My own pale face staring back at me. But as I stepped closer, a sickening realization hit me. My reflection wasn't moving. I was breathing, my chest rising and falling in ragged gasps, but the version of me in the glass stood still, watching, its lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. A deep, primal fear rooted me to the spot. I lifted a shaking hand. My reflection didn't. I turned away sharply, heart pounding so hard it ached. My pulse roared in my ears as I stumbled back toward the table, trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen that it was some trick of the light. Then behind me, I heard a chair scrape against the floor. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my footing. The chair by the fireplace, the one that had been empty, was no longer empty. A figure sat there now. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was Buddy me. Not a shadow, not a ghostly outline. Me. Sitting in that chair, hands resting on the wooden arms, head tilted ever so slightly to the side, watching. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My own face stared back at me with an expression I didn't recognize. Calm, expectant, almost amused. I wanted to run, to break out of this nightmare and never look back. But my feet were rooted to the floor, as if the cabin itself wouldn't let me leave. The figure in the chair slowly lifted a hand and pointed. At the clock. 6:12. A dry whisper filled the air, barely more than a breath. You were always here. I couldn't breathe. The air inside the cabin felt thicker, heavier, as if I was sinking into something unseen. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but my body refused to move. I just stood there, locked in place, staring at myself, the version of me that now occupied the chair by the fireplace. The figure sat perfectly still, its expression unreadable, not smiling, not frowning, just watching. The fire in the hearth remained cold and untouched, yet a strange warmth radiated from that corner of the room. My throat was dry, my heart beat a deafening drum in my ears. Then, slowly, deliberately, the figure spoke. You were always here. The voice wasn't quite mine. It was home, too close, layered with something deeper, something old. The words slithered through the air like echoes in a cave, distorting as they reached my ears. I shook my head violently. No, I just got here. I drove here today. My own voice sounded weak, uncertain, like I was trying to convince myself more than anything. The figure didn't blink. It just lifted a hand and pointed again. At the clock. I didn't want to look, but my eyes betrayed me, drifting toward it against my will. 6:12. Unchanged, unmoving, as if time itself had ceased to exist. A realization settled over me like ice. I had no idea how long I had been standing there. It could have been a couple of minutes, or days. The figure in the chair tilted its head. What is the last thing you truly remember? I opened my mouth, but no words came. The last thing I remembered was driving here, the winding forest road, the way the trees loomed like sentinels, the moment my GPS cut out, the moment I lost track of time. Had I checked the time? Before? I arrived, a cold sensation crawled up my spine. I tried to recall the drive in detail, but the memories were loose, fragmented, like a dream that crumbled the harder I tried to hold on to it. The gas station stop, had that actually happened? The last song that played on the radio, what was it? I couldn't remember. A quiet laugh echoed through the cabin, low and knowing. The figure, my reflection, my doppelganger, leaned forward slightly, resting its elbows on its knees. You feel it, don't you? It murmured. I took a shaky step back. Feel what? It gestured around us to the stillness, the air that never moved, the sky frozen in twilight. This place isn't a place. The words settled over me like a suffocating weight. What are you talking about? I whispered. My voice barely carried, as if the cabin itself swallowed the sound. The figure exhaled, almost tiredly. You keep telling yourself you just arrived. But deep down, you know the truth. It leaned back into the chair, gaze heavy. You never left. A sharp, splitting pain shot through my skull. I stumbled, gripping the edge of the table for balance. Images flickered through my mind like a glitching film reel. A car, skidding on the wet road, the sickening crunch of metal, the weightless moment before impact, the forest swallowing everything whole. I gasped, my knees nearly giving out. No, that wasn't real. That didn't happen. I got here. I walked inside. The figure stood. Not in a sudden jerky movement, but smoothly, too fluidly, like time worked differently for it, like it wasn't bound by the same rules as me. You never arrived, it said softly. You never left that road. The walls of the cabin shuddered. The floor beneath me groaned like wood ready to collapse. The fireplace, cold and dead seconds ago, burst into flames. But the fire cast no heat, no flickering shadows. just an unnatural glow that filled the room, pulsing like a heartbeat. The cabin wasn't real. This place, where time stood still, was a trap, and I'd been here longer than I could comprehend. The cabin trembled around me, the wooden walls stretched and wreathed, expanding as if the entire structure were alive. The fire in the hearth pulsed with unnatural light, its glow flickering without heat, without warmth, just emptiness. The figure, myself but not myself, stood motionless watching, its presence pressed against my skull like an unbearable weight, warping my thoughts, pulling me deeper into something I didn't understand. You never left. The words echoed through the cabin, but they weren't spoken aloud. They came from inside me, a whisper curling through my own mind like creeping vines, seeping into the cracks of my fragile reality. I staggered back, my breath ragged. "This isn't real," I gasped. This is some kind of hallucination, a nightmare." The figure tilted its head. "Is it?" The walls groaned, the clock shuddered against the wood, my pulse pounded against my ribs, and yet I couldn't feel my own heartbeat. A horrifying thought rooted itself in my mind, unshakable, undeniable. If time wasn't moving, was I even alive? Panic surged through me. I turned, bolted for the door. My fingers gripped the knob, twisting desperately, yanking, but it wouldn't budge. The wood was ice-cold beneath my hands, and the moment I touched it, a sharp, electric shock tore through my body. The doorframe shimmered. The grain of the wood rippled, the handle warping beneath my grasp like melted wax. The cabin was no longer just a place. It was something far worse. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting. I turned to the window, my only other escape. But the moment I did, my stomach dropped. The reflection was still there. Still me, still watching. But now, it was smiling. And then, it moved. I hadn't moved, but the reflection raised a hand, pressed it against the glass from the other side. The skin was pale, too pale, as if it had never touched sunlight. Its lips parted slightly, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. And then, it stepped forward. Not a claw, the reflection. Out, the glass rippled like water, and suddenly, I was the one behind it. I staggered back, my hands hitting cold, hard surface. The cabin was on the other side. The fire still burned, the figure still stood in the center of the room. But now, I was the reflection. My breath caught in my throat. I pounded against the glass, screaming, but no sound came. I watched, helpless, as the Dodemquali straightened its posture, rolling its shoulders like it was settling into my skin. Then, it turned and walked out the door. I unscreamed, pounding harder, but the glass was thick, unyielding. The fire in the cabin flickered, dimming, until only darkness remained. And then, the clock moved. 6:12 shifted to 6:13. The first change since I arrived, and I felt it. A slow sinking pull, like the moment between wakefulness and sleep, when reality starts to dissolve. I was now becoming the reflection, my fingers pressed against the cold surface, my body weightless, hollow. I could feel the cabin pulling me deeper, drawing me into the glass, into the endless abyss behind it. And outside, the Pavpain's other me, the one who had taken my place, was already walking into the forest.